Hi, my name is Dr. Rose Barrowcliffe. I'm a Bachelor Wanamata woman, and today I'm at the Queensland State Archives, where there are over 3.5 million records that were created by government agencies over the past 200 years. These records were created by public authorities, so government departments, boards, councils, universities, and so on. The records at Queensland State Archives are permanent value records, that is, records that have enduring value to the people of Queensland. So, of course, within these records, there's information about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, particularly those that have lived on reserves. And some of the records contain information such as cultural knowledge or traditional knowledge and personal and community histories. And I'm here today to talk with Becky Bly and Clarice Stanley about the really important work they're doing here with First Nations records and metadata. Hi, Becky. Hi, Clarice.
Hi, thank you for having us.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the work that QSA is doing to improve access to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander records?
We really have been focusing in on improving sensitivity statements, talking about how we can information share about what kind of content is within the records, how we can leverage or how we can use dual naming, so we know that a lot of different places across the state are known by, traditional names or names that they have come to be known as, but how we can go about including that in description in the catalogue about the records.
And Rose, you were saying earlier, Queensland State Archives only collect records that are of permanent value to Queensland Government, and a lot of those records will be described in a way that is very government speak, a very colonial view of the records, and organised in a way that suits government agencies, not so much the person that will be coming into QSA looking for records on their family.
Okay, so we're using the word description, but there's another word that we use in archives, which is metadata. Can you explain a bit more about what metadata actually is and why it's important?
When you meet someone who's mob or who's Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander, you always ask them, what's their name and where they're from. And so ensuring that any description about First Nations records captures that information. So people's names and locations or places they may be connected to.
And metadata for me is as simple as when we are finding a photo in our collection, in our family albums, turning it over and seeing the names and the date that are written on the back. That's metadata.
Right. So it is the description of the record, both what's in the record, but also the context of how that record was created.
Yes.
And that metadata is really important to being able to find that record. And the work that you're both doing is helping to enrich that metadata so mob can actually find those records.
And when you talk to the context, it's about who's created that record, who it's about, who it may mention. It may mention, someone's grandparent, but it may also talk to, that person's grandparent has also got connections to other people. So it's really just ensuring that we capture all the information that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people may want to know about. And we're looking at metadata from our view, our point of view, and our ways of thinking. So whatever is relevant to non-Indigenous people may not be relevant to us. So trying to come with that, kind of scope or look or lens of the metadata work.
So what drew you to doing this sort of work?
So for me, I've come from community and personal histories. I've spent 9 years working in that space. So they're the government department in what's known as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander partnerships that provide access to records that were kept under legislation. And the legislation generally is the Protection Acts. So without going too deep into past legislation, I think for me, that's what has developed a passion in that space, because prior to me starting at community and personal histories, I actually came out to Queensland State Archives and wanted to access records about my dad's side of the family, because I had already known about my mum's side, but it was just my dad's side that I felt that there was some missing pieces to my puzzle. Yeah, and I just found that very challenging. I mentioned to you earlier that I came in looking at a record that I thought was about my great-grandfather, but it was actually about my dad's brother, and not understanding some of those results that I found when searching the catalogue was a bit challenging. But like I said, until I started work in community and personal histories, I was able to understand why there were some, rules and regulations around accessing those records. But coming from my personal background, but also that background with community and personal histories, I can understand where the gaps are, and I'm hoping that I can leverage off some of that knowledge that I've gained to support others with that same shared challenge.
Clarice and I both have families that were born into these reserves that government controlled the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So people like my grandmother were unaware of how much information was kept on them. So now we want to be able to make it more easier for them to access, so they are able to discover family history and information about their family, communities, to better understand their backgrounds.
Why does access to these records matter so much to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
We know that having an unbroken connection in this space, and especially in community identity, is very important. We know that for the most part, the yarns about your identity sit, with yarns with your elders or being passed down orally. But these government records contain, it is the physical evidence of some of those oral yarns. Although we know that it's only one piece to that puzzle to connecting your identity and connection to family and community, but it really gives the hard evidence of, what was happening to, like Becky was saying, our nans and pops on missions and reserves. And we know that sometimes that history they never really spoke about. So I guess for me also it's honouring that kind of information that sits within those records. Our mob didn't know that these records were being kept, so it was, a shock to some of them that were accessing them for the first time. And going back to my story, my dad's parents had passed away way before I had come along in this world, and it was my only way of knowing who they were, how they were, and how, just it gave insight to their story. And I was saying in a team meeting not so long ago that just knowing that my nana was a certain way and how they wrote about her, I guess, gave me strength more, and understanding that's probably who she is probably who I am, and I never got to know her. So I think that's been really strong for me, and the fact that I'm able to be in this space to support that for other people, is a great privilege to myself. And I know Becky would share that as well.
I think it really speaks to the fact that government records are not just minutes from meetings, they are deeply personal for a lot of people, and particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which is why the work that both you do is so important.
No other people in Queensland had records written about them as much as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people did living under the Act.
And we've had that personal understanding and lived experience of seeing how the records have helped heal our family. So we're able to take that care and knowledge of how important it is to make sure that communities are able to access these records and be able to heal a part of their history.
Yeah, it's really important work. So, what have been some of the challenges to making the records accessible for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people?
A large part of the challenges are the way that government agencies have catalogued or put together records in a way that suits record keeping, colonial record keeping. The more we understand agencies' policies, it helps us to know what type of information is kept in those records.
I think the challenge is working in a system that is not set up for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander ways of seeing the world. I think for me, one of the biggest challenges has always been, I guess, transparency.
It's a system set up suited for practices around record keeping that was a very colonial view.
Yeah. And not taking in those in which they were written about. I feel like it's very, like Becky's saying, this is the government, this is what we wrote about you, but not taking in the fact that these are actual, people, these are someone's parents or grandparents or great-grandparents. And I think elements to that still exist. And I think that's been one of my biggest challenges. I know it's important to get community involved because we know, coming from, urban communities, that we don't speak for all communities all over Queensland. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is getting them. How do we get other communities involved to let them know that records are held here about your families, your communities, your mob, and to, start to talk to them about how they may want records described about them. And I guess then that could lean into right to reply and TK labels. I'm really mindful that my work in this space is about being the first cycle of ensuring that the information is unlocked for people. Mm-hmm. So whatever I'm doing now is only the first step. It's only just to let people know that these records sit here. And then hopefully in the future we can talk about, like I said before, how you can then tell us how to describe these records or how you want these records, in the catalogue.
And 3.5 million records that are held here at QSA, it's always going to be finding a needle in a haystack. Mm-hmm. So the better informed we are about where records could be found that relate to our mob, the easier it is to discover records.
Yeah. You're trying to use the catalogue in a way that promotes access and discoverability. What have been some of the things that you have been doing over the past year or so that you've been working with these records? So
there's a process now to let our team know that whenever permanent records are being transferred to Queensland State Archives, whether the records contain Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander information, that previously wasn't an option. So that would mean that records would come here to Queensland State Archives, be initially looked at and then stored on the shelf. And then it would be, some years later that our team would then have to go through and do an audit or an assessment on the records. So one of the first digital archive transfers this year contained, information about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, which was, I think, a win for me. I didn't think that it would be that soon that we were involved with those processes, that it would be used so quickly. So I'm really excited about that and where that could lead into the future.
And catalogue updates that have happened, like the IATSIS language codes. Could you explain a bit about those new developments in the catalogue that support ease of access?
Yeah, so Queensland State Archives has a languages project here, and Uncle Des Crump is involved with that. So some of the work that he has been doing with having a look at the records and just trying to see what information is in there has been great for our team. As Becky mentioned, some of the system developments or enhancements that have come to the Queensland State Archives catalogue is about those AATSIS language codes. And as I mentioned before, Uncle Des's work has been helpful with us applying those. So now you'll be able to look at a record in a catalogue and it will have the AATSIS information attached to it.
So that means you could also search using that IATSIS language code for
your language. So 12 months ago, we weren't able to search up place names of Waka Waka, Barramba, Cherbourg. So now with our team has worked towards making sure that the online catalogue community can search up place names like that.
So those are two monumental shifts, I would say.
I would say so. I think being coming from the community and personal histories background, we know that it's important to have place location. Because you might have early on in your family history an ancestor or a great-grandmother known only as Rosie, and she may be connected to multiple different locations. And in order to ensure that the records that we give access to, or the records that you're looking to access, is about your Rosie, including that kind of information is important. So going back to the IATSIS language code implementation, it's also been helpful with adding subjects to a record that may not always be initially clear if that contains language information. So the way in which we've decided to include IATSIS Auslan codes is through subjects. So whilst that record is not evidently about languages, we can apply a subject to then let community know that this record may have information about, like Becky said, Waka Waka or...
So one of the examples that I've seen of that was some of the correspondence about the names of railway stations, which you wouldn't possibly think to look there for Indigenous languages or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages, but because they named some of those stations using Aboriginal languages, then they do have that information there. So this is where you're taking a government record that has only been previously described in terms of how that department worked. It's now also containing the description of that Aboriginal language that's in that record as well.
So as we said, the catalogue is not about our worldviews, it's about, government business. And like you said, it's that example of railways and naming railways. And like you said, they spoke to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and that's not going to be evident in the record title, but the way in which we've included that information is by way of the IATSIS Auslan code.
So the work you're doing is really bringing together the pre-existing colonial understanding of that record, but then adding to it the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander understanding of that record as well.
And to build on that, so agencies, we're now trying to proactively describe records better at the point of transfer, but we also have reps full with 3.5 million records that we want to uncover more content and see where the information is kept. And the only way that we're going to find or discover records with First Nations content is by getting the boxes out and going through the records, public using the records too. We have a lot of people coming into the archives in the public space, identifying where they have found records that have First Nations languages information.
I guess to be clear, the work you're doing can save Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people time, because by you and your teams going through the records and describing them better, it saves people spending hours and hours doing that work themselves, hopefully, and they can more quickly identify that this record relates to me and my family by looking at the description of it.
Yes, and not only saving time, but even just letting people know that this record here exists and it could contain information about your family or your community.
How are you considering the cultural sensitivities of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples when you're going about the work you're doing?
I think for me, because I am Aboriginal and, like Becky said, we come from communities that have been, or families that have been affected by past legislation, we come with that early understanding of what is the right way or what is proper way. And I think for me, it's taking in everything that I've learned from, my lived experience to ensure that we do it in the right way.
And so what are you doing within the metadata to support people in that space?
I take a lot of the decisions that I am considering in the metadata improvement space or the metadata enrichment space. So for instance, if I'm wanting to put a sensitivity label on a record, I don't feel like I have the right to make that call without getting soundboarding from those who may be more senior than me, or those who bring, you know, that their expertise in that space. And I think for me, it supports me to make a clear and informed decision.
These records were created at a time where Australia had a very racist, negative viewpoint of First Nations people. So before they're coming into QSA to access the records or accessing the records online, we want to make sure that they're informed about the content of these records and prepare them that it is going to include racist terminology, and then they can make the decision whether they access the records or not.
So how do people access records that might be closed or that might contain sensitive information?
So responsible agencies develop a time period of a record or decide how long a record can be restricted from the public. So sometimes there could be personalised information on adoptions or some other information that can't be open to the public, but there are ways around that. So those records, we call them restricted or closed records. Community can access that by gaining permission directly to the responsible agency.
For me, it's understanding Queensland State Archives' place in this space. Whilst we don't have ownership of the records, it sits with responsible agency. We do oversee the catalogue in which the information is stored about them. So I just wanted to make that point, because I guess sometimes it's confusing to community, them wanting to come to Queensland State Archives to access a record, but also not understanding that they can't give access to that record. They actually have to go to that agency in which that record was created.
Yeah. So the first step is making the record discoverable.
Yes.
And then from there, the decisions about how to access become easier, at least once you can find the record.
So if you were to just come to QSA and research on a community that you're interested in, if a restricted record does come up in your search results, not to be discouraged, that there's ways around gaining access to those records by contacting the responsible agency and just giving a bit of reasoning as to why you need to see the record.
The access policy at Community and Personal Histories was put in place to protect the rights of other people that may be mentioned in the record as well, or any other information about community, like you were saying, Becky, or information that may not be available to be shared is protected.
Becky and Clarice, thank you so much for all the very important work that your team is doing, and thank you for yarning with me today.
Thanks, Rose.
Thank you, Rose.